Mages tend to be pretty good in Fire Emblem. Whether it's powerful pre-promotes like Pandreo and Pent, snowballing training projects like Asbel and Lu, or tanky Nosferatu users like Odin and Tharia, mages always tend to find themselves near the top of most tier lists. And this makes a certain amount of sense. The class itself has some inherent strengths. Magic is usually 1-2 range, which is an upside over 1 range or 2 range locked weapons, and mages can hit their foes on resistance, which is typically the weaker defensive stat. Not only that, but on promotion, oftentimes mages get staff access, allowing them to pull double duty as both a magical attacker and a healing utility unit. Some games will also include spells with bonus effects, such as the iconic Nosferatu or the cav-killing Dark Spikes. But there is one setting where, despite these advantages, mages tend to come up short, and that is Tellius, the continent on which Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn take place. Because after the incredibly busted Sage Pent and the honestly still great Sage Saleh, Intelligent Systems was clearly afraid of mages breaking the game. So they took a couple of hammers to every mage in the country's kneecaps, and this is the result. To start out, mages are already at a bit of a deficit in Path of Radiance since they're an infantry class in a world dominated by mounts. As Path of Radiance has a lot of really big maps, and mounted units not only have higher move, but also all innately have the Canto ability, meaning that they can keep moving even after attacking. As such, it can often be difficult for infantry to keep up with the main force of your army. But mages are, for some reason, given armored movement in this game, meaning they have 1 less move than even other infantry. As such, not only will your mages be falling behind the Cavaliers, Pegasus Knights, and Dragons, but they will also be outpaced by Myrmidons, soldiers, and thieves. Don't get me wrong, it's not a completely lost cause. There's a few ways to make up for mages' movement. The most immediately apparent is their ranged weapons, because while a Myrmidon can move 1 more tile than mages, they're stuck on 1 range weapons, whereas mages can attack at 1-2 range. So both Myrmidons and mages are capable of attacking a foe 7 tiles away from them. The mage simply moves 5 tiles and attacks 2 tiles, whereas the Myrmidon moves 6 tiles and attacks 1 tile. But the more permanent solution to mages' movement issues is to shove or rescue them around. And this does work if your only concern is bringing mages to the front line, but when zooming out and looking at your whole army, mages are still a liability if you have to rescue drop them around or dedicate shove bots to getting them forward. These rescues and shoves eat into your army's overall action economy. This amount of ferrying can still be useful for particularly strong units. For example, Oswin comes immediately to mind as a low-move combat god that I'm perfectly fine ferrying around with the Christmas calves. But unfortunately, low movement is only the beginning of mages' problems. The next most obvious issue is that tomes, the weapon type used by mages, are just incredibly weak. The basic Wind Tome has 2 might. Fire is right ahead of it at 3 might, and even Thunder, the strongest of the basic magic tomes, comes in at a measly 4, putting it 1 might behind the Iron Sword. But Thunder is also more expensive than a basic Iron Sword and has lower accuracy at 85 as compared to Iron's 90. In theory, tomes do have the upside of being lighter weight as compared to physical weapons, but in practice, this upside doesn't really matter. You see, weapon weight is offset by the strength stat in Tellius, and so after Chapter 8, none of your physical units are ever going to get weighed down by any weapon they wield. I'm sorry, but if you have an Iron Sword user who has less than 7 strength, not only have you modified the game, but you're also in a pretty bad situation, such that being weighed down by an Iron Sword is the least of your problems. Meanwhile, since mages have little to no strength and use their magic stat for damage, they are actually liable to get weighed down by their relatively light tomes. Thunder's weight of 3 is easily offset, but once you start working your way up the totem pole, an Thunder weight of 6 might actually cause Soren to lose a couple of points of speed. As such, in every numerical area, tomes are just behind physical weapons, although they do have a couple of non-numerical advantages. The first is each school of magic deals effective damage to a different type of enemy. Fire tomes deal effective damage to beast lagoos, thunder tomes deal effective damage to dragon lagoos, and wind tomes deal effective damage to all flyers. But this isn't the saving grace that tomes needed. Beast lagoos and dragon lagoos are extraordinarily rare enemy classes, so Thunder and Fire is rarely actually able to leverage that effective damage. But even Wind, which is able to hit flyers and thus much more applicable, doesn't really benefit that much from effective damage. In Path of Radiance, the way effective damage works is it doubles a weapon's might. So if you use a Wind Tome with a might of 2 against an enemy, then it turns into a tome with a might of 4. Not a particularly big upgrade. Elwind likewise goes from 4 to 8, and even Tornado, the highest rank magic tome you have access to, goes from 6 to 12. Meaning that when leveraging effective damage, the A rank wind spell still has less might than a silver sword. But the lower might of tomes have even more cascading consequences for mages. Because one of the most powerful tools you get in Path of Radiance is the Forge system, wherein you can take a weapon and modify its stats to get extra might, extra hit, or even extra crit. But the price of forges is actually determined based on the percentage you're adding to a weapon's value. And so, since tomes have naturally lower mights, increasing a tome's might by 2 is going to be way more expensive than increasing a lance's might by 2. Since for a tome, you've given it a 200% might upgrade, whereas a lance is only gaining about 20% might. Worse still, even if money is no object, you have fewer forging options for tomes than you do for other weapons. You see, when selecting what weapon to use as a base, for swords, axes, lances, and bows, you can start with an iron, steel, silver, or throwable variant where applicable. But if you're forging a tome, you always have to start with the basic version of wind, thunder, fire, or light. So once you get into the mid-game, you're given the option between giving one of your physical units a forged steel weapon, or giving one of your magical units a generic forged tome, which is just going to be underwhelming in comparison. But in fairness, mages aren't exactly a stranger to having lower might weapons than their physical counterparts. It comes as a bit of a trade-off in exchange for hitting on resistance, which is typically the lower of the two defensive stats. And this truism does maintain in Path of Radiance, where most enemy classes will have less res than defense, but the difference between defense and res is a lot less extreme here than in basically any other title. In many games, enemy resistance is at or around 0 for the majority of the campaign. But in Path of Radiance, that's simply not true. After the first 4 or so chapters, all enemies you encounter will have some amount of resistance. Even generals, which are typically the class most associated with low res, have 5 or 10 resistance depending on the point in the game you're at. And non-general classes, such as fighters and paladins, have an even lower difference, with most fighters in the mid-game having a difference of 4 between their defense and res. And upon reaching the mid-game, there's a surprising number of enemies that have equal or even greater resistance as compared to their defense. Shoutouts to the Chapter 21 General mini-boss, who has more res than defense for no adequately explored reason. With all of these downsides, you might wonder why anyone bothers fielding mages in Path of Radiance anyway. If they've got everything working against them, surely they should just be bench warmers. And I wouldn't blame you for thinking this, but mages do have one pretty significant advantage I've yet to mention, and that is access to siege tomes. These are weapons with 3 to 10 range that you can use to attack enemies from very far away. And while they're heavy enough that your mages aren't going to be able to double, they can still be valuable for chip or just finishing off a weakened foe without needing to cross a large swath of the map. These long-ranged weapons have existed in other Fire Emblems as well, but Path of Radiance gives you more than most other games up until that point in the franchise. In total, you get access to 5, although only 4 of them can be used by mages. You get 2 copies of Bolting, 1 copy of Meteor, and a copy of Blizzard. In theory, you could steal extra copies from the enemy mages that pelt you with siege tomes, but in practice, this is functionally impossible, as even if you were able to rig strength level ups such that Volk could steal these heavy books, you can't steal an equipped item. So you would either have to silence the mage on a key turn, or trick them into equipping a different weapon. Something that really isn't going to happen because Siege Tome users can move in this game, and so they are much more privy to running away and pelting you from 5 range than attacking you up close. Still, 4 Siege Tomes at 5 durability apiece means you're able to pelt enemies from far away 20 times over the course of a game. And this can be used for some ridiculously strong strategies. But as if it's a cruel joke, Path of Radiance had to nerf mages one more time on the way out the door to make even siege tomes a cold comfort. Because rather than all tomes being considered a singular weapon rank, such as your tome rank or anima rank, Thunder, Wind, and Fire are all given separate ranks from each other that you must raise individually if you want to access their respective siege tomes. The good news is, because siege tomes come at C rank, it's not an impossible task, but it is still yet another annoyance on top of a class that didn't need any more nerfs. Of course, all of this is just talking about the mage class in a vacuum, but it's still entirely possible for a unit in a good class to be bad, or a unit in a bad class to be good. So I want to briefly take a look at the 5 mages in Path of Radiance because, believe it or not, the individual case studies for these units makes the mage class come off even worse than it initially did on paper. Your first potential mage is Soren, a level 1 wind mage who joins in Chapter 4. Soren's stats are exactly what you expect out of a mage. High magic, okay speed, and terrible bulk. As such, in theory, he should function as a fairly competent glass cannon. But in order to get him there, you're going to have to train him. Although, in fairness, this isn't a super tall order since he joins at the very beginning of the campaign. The first 7 chapters of Path of Radiance basically exist so you can pump experience into whichever of Ike, Boyd, Oscar, Soren, and Riss you plan on using long term. So even if you're not going out of your way to baby Ike's boyfriend, he's probably going to get a decent amount of experience. And if you've decided you want him to be the mage of your team, you can pretty easily ensure that he's going to get kills instead of chip, especially as he is able to attack most enemies uncountered. But unlike his physical contemporaries, Soren immediately runs into a problem during the training arc, and that is his weapon of choice, tomes. He starts with a wind tome in his inventory, and in addition to being just a worse weapon than the iron axes and steel lances everyone else gets to wield, wind itself is stuck at 40 durability. And you won't get another magical weapon until near the end of Chapter 7, when a random mage drops their fire tome. As such, there's an upper ceiling to the amount of experience Soren can grab during that early portion of the game. At most, he's going to participate in 40 rounds of combat, although realistically, it's probably closer to a ceiling of 20 or 30, since Soren is going to be getting most of his kill power from doubling as opposed to one-shotting. As such, despite 4.5 extra chapters of availability, it's not unheard of for Soren to find himself lagging behind Ilyanna when she joins as a level 6 mage. Speaking of which, Ilyanna has a very similar stat spread to Soren, although for the most part, her stats are going to be lower, with less magic and speed, although a respectable amount of both. Aside from the gimmick of her strength stat being non-negligible, Ilyanna's main deal is just being a unit you don't have to feed as much XP to as Soren if you want to train one of the mages. Ultimately, she's not super flashy with unimpressive stats and a very bad class, but she doesn't demand that much in terms of investment, so this can be appealing to people who want a sage on their team. But if you're looking for something a little bit fancier, Tormod offers you an interesting choice. He comes with the skill Celerity, which boosts his movement from 5 to 7, and this means he's actually able to outpace his fellow infantry instead of falling behind them like Soren and Ilyanna do. This is pretty spectacular, but it comes at a not insignificant cost. Tormod's stats are generally going to be less impressive than either of the other mages. He has the lowest magic growth of the trio, and while his speed growth is actually higher than both Soren and Ilyanna, it is offset by his pretty abysmal base of 9. Although stats are probably the least of Tormod's worries, because the bigger concern is Tormod is incredibly underleveled. He's a level 7 unpromoted mage who joins around the time most of your army should be hitting level 20 and promoting. As such, if you would like to add Tormod to your roster, you're going to have to either give him a healthy dollop of bonus experience, or baby him for a not insignificant portion of the mid-game. The payoff for this is a mage that gets to ignore one of the class's downsides, that being armored movement, but still has to deal with everything else magic users have working against them. So whether or not that's worth the hefty investment is up to your judgment. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Calil, a pre-promoted sage who asks for no investment whatsoever. Not only does she join with phenomenal weapon ranks, being able to wield every siege tome in the game at base, but Calil also has quite good stats. The only mage who would have better stats than her at an equivalent level is Soren, and just barely, as he sports on average 2 extra magic and 1 extra speed. As such, Calil feels like an incredibly tempting proposition to skip over the painful training arcs of the 3 unpromoted magic users. But the pre-promoted sage comes with a pretty significant downside. Unlike traditional sages, she is incapable of wielding staves. Instead, she comes with tomes and knives. Knives being a weak physical weapon that uses Calil's lower strength stat as opposed to her high magic. Tormod, Ilyanna, and Soren all get the option to gain E-rank staves on promotion, so if you want a sage that can also function as a healer, you're going to have to train one of them up instead of going with the pre-promote. Personally, I prefer Calil to any of the training projects because I find E-rank staves are not particularly helpful at the point in the game you end up promoting units, but I know for many people the role consolidation of Staffer, Siege Tomes, and Magical Combat is a tempting proposition to roll up into a single deployment slot. And unfortunately, if that's what you want, Calil isn't offering it. And that brings us to the last of Path of Radiance's mages, Bastian, who is another pre-promoted sage stuck on knives instead of staves, and is in basically every way just worse than Calil. He joins you much later in the campaign than Calil, and at a reasonably higher level, but his base stats are actually, for the most part, kind of worse than hers. In particular, his lower speed and equal magic are incredibly unimpressive. Moreover, Bastian has lower weapon ranks, although he still is able to wield all 3 siege tomes, so it's not really any big deal. Overall, Bastian feels less like a unit you would consider adding to your main team, and more like a filler character that you would throw on the squad during big maps like Clash, where you have more deployment slots than normal. Although he does have one niche strategy you can use with him, since he starts with the corrosion skill that you can use to dissolve enemies' weapons. If you have him fight siege tome users with your own siege tomes, he can functionally get rid of their weaponry if corrosion procs. This is not only RNG reliant, but also incredibly niche, so I don't see it as a super valuable application, but it's about the only thing Bastian has going for him, so I figured it was at least worth a mention. As you can probably tell, in addition to the mage class itself being underwhelming, none of the 5 player-controlled mages offer enough to make up for these shortcomings. Low move, low damage output, and low bulk are just a deadly combination that it is nearly impossible to overcome. The siege tomes are tempting enough that I think most teams probably want at least one of the Path of Radiance sages, but I would have a hard time justifying any more than that unless you really like them as characters. Although, in fairness, Path of Radiance is an incredibly easy game, so it's not like you need to use all the best units to stand a chance against your foes. And to be clear, this is true for every Fire Emblem game. Although it is certainly harder to justify fielding exclusively benchwarmers in difficult games, such as Path of Radiance's direct sequel, Radiant Dawn. And would you believe me if I told you that mages were actually nerfed even further in the transition from Path of Radiance to Radiant Dawn? Mages took inspiration from the fact they had Armor Knight movement and decided to lean in with full Armor Knight stats, as every single mage in the game has seen a significant debuff to their speed growth. And they can't even overcome this Achilles heel through luck or stat booster because both the Sage and Arcsage class have abysmal speed caps. Every single tome-using final class is actually incapable of doubling the final boss, even with speed-boosting tools like Whitepool. But honestly, their speed issues show up even before the final boss, as many of them will have difficulty doubling Armor Knights and Generals around their join time, and mages find themselves consistently doubled by even mid-speed foes like Paladins. The good news is tomes got buffed. Well, at least Fire and Wind tomes got buffed. But if you're a fan of Thunder tomes, unfortunately, they got nerfed into the fucking ground. And this is extra bad because most tomes feel just a lot worse to use in Radiant Dawn, as enemies have higher resistance on average than they did in Path of Radiance. So while Wind and Fire are strictly better than they were in the prequel, it often feels like they're worse. And Thunder was hit particularly hard as it lost a significant amount of might and hit in exchange for 5 crit rate. Woohoo! Siege tomes, the one saving grace of mages in Path of Radiance, still exist in Radiant Dawn, but they're much rarer and show up much later. You get a single meteor tome in Calil's starting inventory at around the halfway point of the game, but considering Calil leaves the story for an extended period of time, without prior knowledge, it's actually surprisingly possible to miss out on this siege tome for most of the Grail Mercenaries fights. And aside from the Meteor Tome, your only other siege weapons are a Blizzard that you can purchase in Micaiah's army despite not having any anima users, and a second Meteor Tome that Tormod shows up with at the very end of the game. You can, at the very least, use the blessing mechanic to allow you to infinitely spam siege tomes for the last 3 maps, but in many ways this feels like too little too late for a class that struggles for 99% of the game's story. Much like before, I do want to zoom in and take a look at each individual mage, and lucky for us, Radiant Dawn actually has the exact same 5 mages as Path of Radiance. Although, given Radiant Dawn's weird structure, these characters join in a slightly different order than last time. This time, Ilyanna joins you first, as a Thunder Mage with the Dawn Brigade. And unlike in Path of Radiance, she is locked to just using Thunder, which is unfortunate because Thunder is the worst tome type in the game. This mostly limits her to a role of doing inaccurate chip and failing to double. Now, the Dawn Brigade honestly needs as much help as it can get, so a little bit of inaccurate chip from Ilyanna is still useful, but it still feels underwhelming in the grand scheme of things. Especially since, even if you spend an early Master Seal to promote Ilyanna and give her Fire and Wind access, she's unable to purchase Fire or Wind tomes until Tormod joins, at which point she's so thoroughly outclassed that you might as well bench her. Speaking of being thoroughly outclassed, later in the campaign, Ilyanna joins the Grail Mercenaries, but here, she is going to be super far behind not only her direct competition, Soren, the Wind Mage, but also everyone else in Ike's army. It's honestly quite tragic. By moving between the Dawn Brigade and the Grail Mercenaries, Ilyanna technically has the highest availability of any unit in Fire Emblem X. But she would be more useful if she had just stayed with Micaiah, because honestly, the Dawn Brigade needs a mage much more than the Grail Mercenaries do. On the other end of the availability spectrum, we have Tormod. Tormod joins in Part 1, Chapter 7, and his stats are actually pretty phenomenal. He will dominate enemies on his join map, and he's still useful in Chapter 1.8 as well as 1 endgame. It seems for all the world he's going to be the exception to the Mage's Bad rule. But then he just disappears from the fucking game for basically the rest of the campaign. He rejoins you 1 chapter before endgame, and his stats have not improved at all whatsoever, so as you can imagine, a unit who was good in Part 1 is awful at the end of the game. The sad thing is, if Tormod stayed with the Dawn Brigade, he would probably be on the same level as someone like Nolan or Zahar, characters whose long-term potential is questionable, but who help you out during all of the difficult Part 3 chapters. But alas, that's not the world we live in, so instead of being a superhero, Tormod is kind of just a meme. Although, arguably, he's not as much of a meme as his fellow Fire Sage, Calil. Calil joins in Part 2, specifically Part 2 Endgame, and she has a Meteor Tome on a defend map, so the game is pretty heavily trying to signal to you that she's going to pelt enemies from long distance to help hold the line. But honestly, even in Part 2, I don't find her meteor damage to be all that helpful. And if you waste it on these useless generals, you're kind of just throwing away a resource that would be much more valuable in the hands of the Grail Mercenaries. Much like Tormod, Calil has an extended absence from the game, as after her first chapter, she doesn't show up again until 3-8. Here, she assists Joffrey's Knights at putting out a few fires, and then joins up with the Grail Mercenaries, but it's too little too late. All of the Grail Mercs are almost certainly going to be in their Tier 3 classes, and as a result, Calil struggles to fit in. In fairness, Joffrey's squad does get 1 Master Crown, and Calil is a decent candidate for it, but even instant promoted, her stats are just going to be worse than Soren's. And while Archsages get stabbed, so a promoted Calil can finally live the dream of casting Heal, Heal is not all that helpful at this stage of the game. E-rank stabs just isn't cutting it when we're entering Part 4. In fairness to Calil, this is not really a problem specific to her and more just the game mistreating all of the Crimean Royal Knights, but I'm sure it's cold comfort on the bench to know that she shares the fate of units like Kieran and Makalov. And that brings us to Soren, the mage with arguably the most going for him. Unlike his peers, Soren is actually around for the majority of the game, as he joins in the first chapter of Ike's army and remains there until endgame. And Soren's stat spread is basically the second coming of Lilina. He's got a very high magic stat and basically nothing else. But a super high magic stat is helpful if you're just trying to nuke foes, either by attacking uncountered or using siege tomes. If you want to train up a mage for endgame, Soren is undeniably the best one to go with. But unfortunately, he's still a mage in Radiant Dawn, so he's gonna be held back by a weak weapon type, a low speed stat, and abysmal bulk. Early on in Ike's campaign, Soren finds himself getting doubled and potentially even one-rounded by generic foes. Add that on top of the armored movement and only mediocre damage output, and Soren feels pretty disappointing compared to the other Grail mercenaries. The nicest thing I can say about Soren is he isn't really held back by any personal fault, just he's stuck in a bad class. Soren is kind of the perfect case study of why mages are bad in Radiant Dawn. Whereas with the other mages, you could point to things like low level or extended absences. None of that exists to explain why Soren is still disappointing. It's just a matter of mage not being a good place to be. It's unfortunate, but we thank you for your service. Now get back to the bench and wait for your boyfriend, okay? Before we go, I should touch upon Bastian, the last mage to join you, but much like in Path of Radiance, his problem is mostly just low availability. Bastion is only around for one map before you have to head into the endgame tower. And as such, he mostly exists for the rare person that wants an Arcsage in the tower but didn't train Soren. Aside from availability, he is of course held back by the low speed of the Arcsage class and the terrible weapon type that tomes are. But you've heard me say all that before, so I should probably wrap the video up before things get too repetitive. And that's also why I'm only talking about the anima sages instead of repeating myself over and over for the light and dark users as well. But I will happily repeat myself for my patrons. So let's do this whole thank you thing again. Thank you to Glupshido, Erica Ford, Pergnite, YL01, George Grenville, the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floahay, Amy Hazel, Hungry Heart, Hound Dogs, Kilroy, Lovis Roman, Shinthia, Faulty Videos, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Foogle, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, JT Spritters, Ziggy WSB, Dysike, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Control Aegis, Roman Cormantic, Nick Knack, Hammer Smack, Carrier Has Left, Angel Nap Caceres, Zanwiff, Not Gino, Flynn Gone, Edward C, Cyrockin 2, Cabbage, SUP, Caius Cole, Bree, Punchfighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Dragonback Lancer, Sardonic Muse, Zero Gamer, Femtal Illness, Wannabe Cinnabon, Punk Tattoo Guy, Key the Iron Idol, Calamity Callie, Jackson McMahon, Saren Gurlixy, Rezi, Dano, Anna, Andu, Rhea, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Your Doctor, Frozen Helm, Patwit, KH, Electric Giga, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Dylan Solis, Some Trade, Squeegee555, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alenby, They Thumb, Clan, Pillow Willow, and especially my Jagans, Your Best Friend 9000, Alexander Roper, Lil Man, Sensitive Luigi, Adele, Siggy, KTRRK2, and Autumn. If you are interested in joining the names currently clogging up your screen, then there is a link to my Patreon down below, where you'll get access to things like early videos, polls that influence the channel, and a couple of other benefits. But please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. But for now, regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.